7 months pregnant, Lady Alina Moreau clawed at the iron gate of her own palace, screaming as flames devoured the stone walls behind her. Through the bars, she saw him, her husband, Lord Cedric Moreau, standing in the courtyard with the key in his hand and his arm wrapped around Marielle, the maid she trusted like a sister. Alina's voice broke as she begged, "Cedric, please. The baby." But her husband didn't move. He stared at her through the iron bars, his face cold as marble, while Marielle whispered something in his ear and smiled. Then Cedric turned his back, pocketing the key, and walked away. Marielle glanced over her shoulder one last time, her lips curling into a triumphant smirk. "It'll finally be just us," she said loud enough for Alina to hear. Once she's gone, the flames roared louder. The heat pressed against Alina's skin like 1,000 burning hands. She sank to her knees, her vision blurring, her lungs choking on smoke. That night, they thought they'd won. The fortune, the estate, the title, everything that belonged to Lady Alina Moreau. But the fire didn't kill her. It baptized her in rage. And now, she's coming back. Not as the trusting wife they destroyed, but as the woman who will reclaim everything they stole and burn their perfect lies to ash. This is the story of how a dead woman crawled out of the flames to destroy the people who locked the gate behind her. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Paris, Dubai, maybe New York or Kingston? We want to know. 3 weeks before the fire that should have killed her, Lady Alina Moreau stood in the grand kitchen of Moreau Palace, arranging white lilies in a crystal vase for the evening's charity gala. Her gown, custom-tailored in emerald silk, draped elegantly over her 7-month belly. Every so often, she paused to rest her hand where the baby kicked, smiling softly to herself. At 28 years old, Alina had everything a woman could want. The Moreau estate stretched across 50 acres of manicured gardens and ancient oak trees. The palace itself, a limestone fortress with arched windows and wrought iron gates, had been in Cedric's family for generations. Alina had restored it room by room, pouring her heart into every detail. The velvet curtains, the hand-painted ceilings, the library filled with first-edition books. She hosted fundraisers for orphanages. She organized literacy programs for the village children. The people adored her. They called her Lady of Grace. But more than the estate, more than the status, Alina loved her husband. Lord Cedric Moreau had been magnetic from the moment they met at a summit in Vienna 5 years ago. Tall, sharp-featured, with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her, Cedric had a way of making Alina feel like the only woman in the room. He spoke of legacy, of building something eternal together, of raising children who would carry the Moreau name with pride. They married in a ceremony that made headlines. Westminster Abbey, a Vera Wang gown, dignitaries from 12 countries. Their honeymoon in the Maldives felt like a dream. "I'll protect you always," Cedric had whispered on their wedding night, his hand over hers. "You and our children. Forever." Alina had believed him. But somewhere along the way, Cedric changed. His late nights at the estate office grew longer. His smiles grew colder. And Marielle, the young maid Alina had hired out of kindness, began appearing wherever Cedric was. Alina had told herself she was imagining things. She was wrong. The flames that consumed the east wing of Moreau Palace were visible for miles. Orange light twisted against the night sky, casting shadows across the forest that bordered the estate. Most of the staff had fled in panic. The village fire brigade wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. But one man saw everything. Old Henri Beaumont stood at the edge of the tree line, his weathered hands gripping a lantern, his heart pounding in his chest. At 73 years old, Henri had served the Moreau family for half a century. First as gardener to Alina's late father, then as groundskeeper after Lord Moreau passed. He'd watched Alina grow from a curious child running through the hedges into the graceful woman who now lay trapped inside that inferno. And he'd seen Lord Cedric walk away. Henri had been pruning roses near the south garden when he spotted Cedric and Marielle slipping through the side courtyard gate. Cedric's face was blank, emotionless. Marielle clung to his arm, whispering something that made her smile. They climbed into Cedric's black sedan and drove toward the city without looking back. Not once did Cedric glance at the flames. Henry's blood ran cold. He didn't need proof. He understood exactly what had happened. He dropped his shears and ran. Most people didn't know about the servant tunnel. It had been built generations ago during the war, a hidden escape route that connected the palace cellars to the forest. Henri had used it 1,000 times in his youth to sneak firewood and supplies when winters were harsh. Now, he used it to save a life. The tunnel entrance was concealed beneath a stone slab behind the old chapel. Henry's arthritic fingers fumbled with the iron ring, yanking the slab aside. Smoke poured from the opening. The heat was unbearable. He wrapped a wet cloth over his nose and mouth and plunged inside. The passage was narrow, suffocating. Flames licked through cracks in the stone above. Burning debris rained down. Henri crawled forward on his hands and knees, coughing, praying he wasn't too late. When he emerged into the palace cellar, the world was chaos. Fire roared through the corridors above. The iron gate to the east wing glowed red-hot from the heat, and behind it, slumped against the bars, was Lady Alina. Her emerald gown was scorched black. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps. "Lady Alina," Henri shouted, his voice cracking. Her eyes fluttered open. "Henri," she whispered. "The baby, please." Henri grabbed the iron bars and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left. The gate didn't budge. Cedric had locked it from the outside. But the hinges were old, weakened by the heat. Henri slammed his shoulder against the frame once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th blow, the gate groaned and collapsed inward. He dragged Alina through the tunnel just as the ceiling above them began to collapse. They made it to Henry's cabin deep in the forest, a tiny, forgotten structure hidden among the pines. Henri laid Alina on his narrow bed, her body trembling violently. Then she screamed. No, it's too early," Alina gasped, clutching her belly. Her water had broken. The baby was coming. Henri had no medical training, no phone, no help, but he delivered lambs on his brother's farm as a boy. He boiled water, tore clean linens, and prayed harder than he ever had in his life. 3 hours later, as dawn broke over the forest, a baby's cry pierced the silence. Alina wept as Henri placed the tiny girl in her arms. The baby was small, fragile but alive. "She's beautiful," Henri whispered. Alina kissed her daughter's forehead, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "Her name is Elise," she said softly, "after my mother." But even as she held her child, Alina's eyes burned with something darker than grief. Cedric thought she was dead. He thought he'd won. He was wrong. The baby's cries were weak at first, soft, fragile whimpers that barely broke the silence of Henry's cabin. Alina held her newborn son against her chest, tears streaming down her face as his tiny fingers curled around hers. He was small, dangerously small, his skin pale from the premature birth and smoke exposure. "He's breathing," Henri said, his voice thick with relief. "He's a fighter, Lady Alina." Alina pressed her lips to her son's forehead, her body still trembling from exhaustion and trauma. "Lucien," she whispered. "Your name is Lucien, and I promise you, I will make sure you grow up knowing the truth about your father." But even as she spoke those words, her heart shattered into pieces she wasn't sure could ever be put back together. 3 days later, Henri returned from the village with a small, battered television. He set it up in the corner of the cabin, his face grim. "You need to see this," he said quietly. Alina sat up in bed, cradling Lucien in her arms. Henri turned on the television, and her entire world tilted. There on the screen was Cedric. He stood at a podium outside Moreau Palace, dressed in a black suit, his face a perfect mask of grief. Cameras flashed. Reporters pressed forward. And Cedric, her husband, the man who'd locked her inside a burning palace, wiped tears from his eyes. "My wife, Lady Alina Moreau, was the light of my life," Cedric said, his voice breaking. "She was carrying our first child, our son." He paused, covering his face with his hands, as if overcome with emotion. The palace wiring was old. Faulty. We'd been planning renovations, but we didn't act fast enough. And now she's gone. They're both gone. The crowd murmured sympathetically. A reporter asked, "Lord Moreau, how will you move forward?" Cedric straightened, his jaw tight. "I will honor her memory by continuing the charitable work she loved, by preserving the Moreau legacy, by making sure her death was not in vain." Then the camera panned slightly to the left, and Alina's breath stopped. Standing beside Cedric, dressed in a black designer gown, was Marielle. Around her neck hung Alina's diamond necklace, the one Cedric had given her on their wedding day. On her wrist, Alina's gold bracelet. In her ears, Alina's pearl earrings. Marielle dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, playing the part of the grieving companion. But when Cedric wasn't looking, her lips curved into the faintest smile. Alina's hands shook so violently that Henri had to take Lucien from her arms. "He killed me," she whispered. "He killed me, and now he's crying on television. He's wearing a suit. She's wearing my jewelry, and the world believes him." Henri knelt beside her. "Lady Alina." "No." Alina's voice turned cold, sharp as steel. "Alina is dead." Cedric made sure of that. She looked at Henri, and her eyes burned with something dark and unbreakable. "He wanted me dead to take my inheritance, the estate, the fortune my father left me. He wanted to erase Lucien, erase the child that tied him to me. He wanted to start fresh with her." Henri nodded slowly. "What will you do?" Alina stared at the television screen, at Cedric's false tears, at Marielle's stolen jewelry. "I'm going to become someone new," she said quietly. "Someone they'll never see coming." Over the next 4 years, Henri helped Alina forge a new identity. Aria Delmont, a French-Canadian investor with no ties to the Moreau name. Alina trained her body until it was strong. She studied finance, law, corporate strategy. She learned to move through the world like a shadow. And she waited, because Cedric and Marielle thought they'd won. They had no idea the dead woman was coming back. For years had passed since the night Alina Moreau died in the flames of her own palace. At least, that's what the world believed. Moreau Palace had been rebuilt, grander than before. The limestone walls now gleamed with fresh paint. Crystal chandeliers hung in every corridor. The iron gates that had once trapped Alina inside had been replaced with polished bronze, engraved with the Moreau family crest. Lord Cedric Moreau had risen even higher. He was no longer just a wealthy estate owner. He was a businessman, a philanthropist, a political candidate. His campaign for Minister of Economic Development dominated headlines across the country. His face smiled from billboards and magazine covers. His speeches promised progress, integrity, and hope. And beside him, always was Marielle. She no longer wore a maid's uniform. Now she wore Chanel gowns and Cartier diamonds. Alina's diamonds. Marielle had seamlessly transformed from servant to socialite, her past erased as cleanly as Alina's existence. She attended galas on Cedric's arm, cut ribbons at charity events, and gave interviews about supporting her partner's vision for the future. The media adored them. A modern power couple, one magazine called them. "From tragedy to triumph," said another. But neither of them knew that the woman they tried to kill was watching. Aria Delmont stepped out of a black sedan in front of the campaign headquarters in the heart of the city. She wore a tailored navy suit, her dark hair cut into a sleek bob, her face subtly altered with expert makeup contouring. 4 years of training had sculpted her body into something lean and strong. 4 years of study had sharpened her mind into a weapon. She looked nothing like the soft, trusting woman Cedric had married. She looked nothing like the pregnant victim he'd left to burn. Aria adjusted her designer sunglasses and walked through the glass doors with the confidence of someone who belonged. She joined Cedric's campaign team through the Delmont Foundation, a charitable organization she'd quietly built using offshore accounts and strategic investments. The foundation had donated a substantial sum to Cedric's campaign, enough to earn Aria a seat at the table, enough to get close. No one questioned her credentials. No one dug too deep. And no one, not Cedric, not Marielle, not a single person on staff, recognized her. The first time Arya stood face-to-face with Cedric was during a strategy meeting in the main conference room. 15 people sat around the table. Cedric stood at the head, reviewing polling numbers on a digital screen. "We need to emphasize economic recovery," Cedric said smoothly, his voice as charming as ever. "Show the public that I understand their struggles, that I've overcome tragedy myself and emerged stronger." Arya's jaw tightened. She sat at the far end of the table, taking notes, her face calm and unreadable. "Ms. Delmont," Cedric said suddenly, his eyes landing on her. "Your foundation specializes in community rebuilding, correct? What's your take?" Arya met his gaze without flinching. "Tragedy reveals character," she said evenly. "But the public will only forgive you if they believe you've earned redemption. Actions matter more than words." Cedric smiled. "Well said." But something flickered in his eyes, brief, uncertain. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to place her. "Have we met before?" he asked. Arya smiled coolly. "I don't believe so, Lord Moreau." Marielle, seated beside Cedric, studied Arya with narrowed eyes. "Your voice," Marielle said slowly. "It sounds familiar." Arya, I didn't miss a beat. "I get that a lot. I have one of those voices." Marielle didn't look convinced, but she said nothing. Over the following weeks, Arya moved through Cedric's campaign like a ghost. She attended events. She reviewed financial records. She listened carefully to every conversation, every slip of the tongue, and she gathered evidence. Late at night in her apartment, Arya spread files across her desk, documents Henri had smuggled from the palace before it burned, financial records showing suspicious insurance payouts, phone records linking Cedric to a contractor known for arson for hire. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Cedric had orchestrated everything. He'd hired someone to start the fire. He'd locked her inside. He'd cashed in on her death, literally. And now, Arya had proof. She stared at Cedric's campaign photo pinned to her wall, her expression cold and unforgiving. "You thought you buried me," she whispered. "But I'm not dead, Cedric. I'm just getting started." The invitation arrived on embossed cardstock. "You are cordially invited to a private reception at Moreau Palace in honor of Lord Cedric Moreau's campaign." Arya held it between her fingers, her pulse steady but her eyes burning with cold fire. For years ago, this palace had been her prison. Now, she would walk through its doors as a stranger, and no one would know the ghost standing among them. The night of the reception, Arya arrived in a black silk gown, her hair swept into an elegant chignon. She moved through the grand foyer with practiced grace, accepting champagne from servers who had no idea they once served her. Everything had changed. The marble floors gleamed under new crystal chandeliers. Modern art hung where antique tapestries once were. The warmth Alina had poured into every room. The fresh flowers, the family photographs, the cozy sitting areas had been erased. And then Arya saw it. At the top of the grand staircase, where her wedding portrait had once hung in a gilded frame, there was a new painting. Life-sized, commanding. Cedric and Marielle. He stood in a tailored tuxedo, one hand resting possessively on Marielle's waist. She wore a red gown, Alina's favorite color, and the diamond necklace Cedric had given Alina on their wedding night. They gazed at each other in the painting as if they were royalty, as if they'd built this empire together from nothing, as if Alina had never existed. Arya's champagne glass trembled in her hand. She forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, to remember why she was here. "Stunning, isn't it?" Arya turned. A campaign staffer stood beside her, smiling. "They make such a beautiful couple," the woman continued. "It's amazing how Lord Moreau rebuilt his life after such tragedy." Arya's smile was ice. "Yes, amazing." Later that evening, while guests mingled in the ballroom, Arya slipped away. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, her heels silent on the marble. She knew this palace better than anyone, every hallway, every hidden door. She found Cedric's study unlocked. Inside, filing cabinets lined one wall. Arya's hands moved quickly, rifling through folders until she found what she needed. Estate transfer documents, insurance claims, bank statements, her father's estate, The land, the investments, the trust fund he'd left specifically for her had all been transferred into Cedric's name within 6 months of her death. The insurance payout from the fire, for €0.2 million, all claimed by Cedric as the surviving spouse. Arya photographed every page with her phone, her hand steady even as rage coursed through her veins. He'd stolen everything. Her home, her inheritance, her life, and he'd used it to build his political career. Who are you? Arya froze. She turned slowly. Marielle stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp and suspicious. I'm sorry, Arya said smoothly. You. Marielle stepped closer, studying Arya's face. There's something about you. Your voice. The way you move. I've seen you before. Arya met her gaze without flinching. I have one of those faces. People say that all the time. Marielle's eyes narrowed. No, it's more than that. Before Arya could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. An elderly woman appeared. Duchess Isabel Moreau, Cedric's mother. She was frail now, leaning on a cane, but her eyes were still sharp. The Duchess stopped cold when she saw Arya. Her face went white. Her cane clattered to the floor. Alina, she whispered, her voice trembling. The air turned to ice. Marielle's head snapped toward the Duchess. What did you say? Arya's heart pounded, but she didn't break. She bent down, retrieved the cane, and handed it to the Duchess with a gentle smile. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Duchess, Arya said softly. My name is Arya Delmotte, but I've heard I resemble someone. Perhaps that's who you're thinking of. The Duchess stared at her, tears filling her eyes. You look just like her. Arya squeezed the woman's hand. I'm honored, she said quietly. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Marielle frozen in the hallway, her suspicion now a living, breathing thing. That night, Cedric sat in his study, reviewing campaign reports. But the numbers weren't adding up. Donations had mysteriously dropped. Key endorsements had fallen through. Negative stories were leaking to the press, small things but damaging. It's like someone's working against us, his campaign manager said. Cedric's jaw tightened. Find out who. In her penthouse across the city, Marielle paced, her phone pressed to her ear. I need you to look into someone, she said coldly. Arya Delmotte. I want to know everything. And if she's a threat, get rid of her. The fixer on the other end of the line chuckled. Consider it done. The message came at midnight. Emergency meeting. Campaign headquarters. Come alone. Cedric. Arya stared at her phone screen, her expression unreadable. She knew what this was. Marielle's fixer had done his job. They knew who she was, or at least they suspected enough to be dangerous. This was the moment she'd been preparing for. She texted Henri, "It's happening tonight. Stay close." Then she dressed in black, slipped a recording device into her jacket pocket, and drove into the darkness. Campaign headquarters was empty when Arya arrived. The lights were off except for a single lamp in Cedric's corner office. The building felt like a tomb, silent, suffocating, waiting. Arya walked through the glass doors, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step measured, controlled. When she reached Cedric's office, the door was already open. Cedric stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. Marielle sat in a leather chair near the desk, her hands folded in her lap, her face cold and calculating. A designer purse rested beside her, strategically placed within easy reach. Close the door, Cedric said without turning around. Arya stepped inside and closed it softly behind her. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Cedric turned to face her. His eyes were dark, haunted. Who are you? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Arya smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You already know. Marielle stood abruptly, her hand moving toward her purse. You need to leave. Now. But Arya didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on Cedric. 4 years ago, Arya said quietly, you locked your pregnant wife inside a burning palace. You stood outside with your mistress and watched her scream for help. You pocketed the key, turned your back, and let the flames consume her. Cedric's face went pale. You claimed her inheritance, Arya continued, her voice steady, merciless. You cried on television. You played the grieving husband while wearing a designer suit and standing next to the woman who helped you kill her. Marielle's hand was inside her purse now, fingers closing around cold metal. "Stop," Cedric whispered, his voice shaking. "Stop talking." Aria took a step forward. "You thought she was dead. You thought you buried her under rubble and lies and insurance money." Another step. "But she didn't die, Cedric." Another step. "I didn't die." Cedric's legs buckled. He grabbed the edge of the desk for support, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. No, you're dead. You died in the fire. I saw. You saw what you wanted to see," Aria said coldly. "But I survived, and I've spent 4 years rebuilding myself into someone strong enough to destroy you." Marielle yanked a compact pistol from her purse, her hand trembling with rage. "You should have stayed dead," she screamed, aiming it directly at Aria's chest. Aria didn't flinch. "Go ahead," she said softly. "Shoot me." Again, Marielle's finger tightened on the trigger. "Police! Drop the weapon." The office door burst open. 6 armed officers flooded the room, weapons drawn. Marielle spun toward them, but 2 officers tackled her before she could fire. The gun clattered across the floor. "No!" Marielle shrieked, thrashing against the officers. "She's lying. She's a fraud. We have everything," a calm voice said from the doorway. Henri stepped inside, older and frilier than before, but standing tall. In his hand was a small recording device. He pressed play. Cedric's voice filled the room, cold, detached, captured 4 years ago on the night of the fire through a security camera Henri had secretly installed near the courtyard. "It'll look like an accident. Faulty wiring. No one will question it." Marielle's voice, sickeningly sweet. "And the baby?" "Cedric, gone. Finally. And it's just us. A fresh start. Everything she had becomes ours." The recording ended. Silence. Cedric collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. "I did it for love," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I did it all for love." Aria stood over him, her expression carved from stone. "You did it for greed, and now you'll pay for it." 2 officers hauled Cedric to his feet and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. "Lord Cedric Moreau," one officer said formally, "you are under arrest for attempted murder, arson, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit homicide." Marielle screamed as she was dragged toward the door. "This isn't over. You hear me, Alina? This isn't over." But Aria didn't respond. She simply watched as the 2 people who'd tried to erase her were led away in chains, broken, exposed, destroyed. Henri stepped beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Lady Alina," he said softly. "It's finally over." Aria closed her eyes and exhaled, a breath she'd been holding for 4 years. "No, Henri," she whispered. "It's just beginning." The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every seat. Cameras lined the back wall. The world watched as Lord Cedric Moreau and Marielle Duchamp stood before the judge, their hands shackled, their faces pale under the unforgiving courtroom lights. The evidence was overwhelming. The recording, the financial documents, Henry's testimony, the arson investigators' report confirming accelerants had been used, the insurance fraud, the forged death certificate, every lie exposed, every secret dragged into the light. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was firm and unwavering. "Cedric Moreau, you are sentenced to 30 years in prison for attempted murder, arson, conspiracy, and fraud. Marielle Duchamp, you are sentenced to 25 years as an accomplice to these crimes." Marielle screamed. Cedric said nothing. He simply stared at the floor, broken, hollow, a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Guards escorted them out of the courtroom as reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed, and in the front row, dressed in a simple white suit, sat Alina Moreau. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply watched as justice, delayed but not denied, was finally served. The news spread like wildfire. Lady Alina Moreau, alive after 4 years. The woman who rose from the ashes. From victim to victor. Alina Moreau's incredible survival story. The public was stunned. Social media exploded with support. Survivors of abuse reached out to share their own stories. Women who'd been silenced, betrayed, gaslit, they saw themselves in Alina. She became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resilience, not of tragedy, but of transformation. Within weeks, Alina legally reclaimed her identity. Her father's estate was returned to her name. The insurance money Cedric had stolen was seized and restored. The palace, her palace, was hers again. But this time, she would rebuild it on her own terms. 6 months later, Alina stood in the grand foyer of Moreau Palace, watching as workers removed the portrait of Cedric and Marielle from the staircase. In its place, they hung something new, a painting of a phoenix rising from flames, wings spread wide, fierce and unstoppable. "Mama, is that you?" a small voice asked. Alina looked down. Lucien stood beside her, his hand tucked into hers. He was 4 years old now, bright-eyed and curious, with his mother's determination and his grandfather's gentle heart. Alina knelt down and pulled him close. "That's all of us, sweetheart," she said softly. "Everyone who's ever been through fire and refused to let it destroy them." Lucien nodded solemnly, as if he understood. And maybe, in his own way, he did. 1 month later, Alina stood on the palace steps before a crowd of reporters, dignitaries, and survivors. Behind her, a banner stretched across the entrance. The Phoenix Foundation Shelter. Support. Survival. This foundation, Alina began, her voice steady and strong, is for every woman who has been betrayed. Every woman who has been silenced. Every woman who has been told she is too weak, too broken, too damaged to rise again. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "I was locked inside a burning building by the man I loved. I was left to die. My child was left to die. And for 4 years, the world believed I was gone." Her voice didn't waver. "But I didn't die. I survived. And if I can survive, so can you." The crowd erupted in applause. Alina smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and cut the ribbon. The Phoenix Foundation opened its doors. That night, Alina stood alone in the palace library, a glass of wine in her hand, staring out at the gardens she'd once loved. The moon hung low over the trees. The air was cool and quiet. Henri appeared in the doorway, leaning on his cane. "Lady Alina," he said gently, "it's late. You should rest." Alina turned to him, her eyes soft. "Thank you, Henri, for everything. You saved my life." Henri shook his head. "No, my lady. You saved your own life. I just gave you the chance." Alina smiled and raised her glass. "To second chances, then?" Henri raised an imaginary glass. "To second chances." Alina Moreau had been burned alive. She had been betrayed, abandoned, erased. But the fire didn't destroy her. It forged her into the woman no one could ever silence again. And now, she was free. Thank you so much for watching this story, friends. If Alina's journey moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of your own strength, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you powerful, true stories of survival, justice, and resilience every week. Drop a comment below and tell us, what would you have done in Alina's position? And where are you watching from? New York? London? Nairobi? We love hearing from you. Remember, no matter what fire you've been through, you have the power to rise from the ashes. See you in the next story. Stay strong, stay inspired, and never let anyone silence your voice.